the Muslims have begun to understand their religion in European context. New ideas, new institutions arise here and give me more hope for the future of Islam in Europe. With this hope, inshallah, we will organize next conference, perhaps in Bucharest. Where's the Laurencio?
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps in Bucharest, perhaps in Skopje, but or the Montenegro. Okay, Monte Carlo, yes. Why not? Nice city, really. But Montenegro is a little bit better than Monte Carlo, I think. But before we organize our next conference, it will be help us some recommendation and some help from our colleagues from the United States and from the world. Nelson is everywhere. Nelson and Zeki, perhaps they can give us some recommendation or some experience from this conference. What can we do better in the next conference with Nelson and Zeki? I don't know who wants to start. Nelson, you have more experience in Europe and in the world, perhaps Zeki as well.
Nelson goes to
Okay, alphabetically you can start, Nelson, please.
Europe before USA.
Yes, I think the mother.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adnan. All right. Thank you very much, Adnan. And thank you very much, everybody. This has been a fantastic experience. For a start, it's an unusual luxury for any academic institution to be able to run a series of conferences on the same thematic region every year. And what are we now, did you say, the 5th? And you're beginning to think about the 6th. It allows you to develop the theme, both theoretically and in relation to practice and context. It also allows the participants, I mean, I see here, come to this meeting here and I meet old friends and I make new friends from one time to the next. The network is broadening. The knock-on effect is enormous. And if you get an accountant from Deloitte or PricewaterhouseCoopers to evaluate a conference like this, they can't, because you can't quantify the results, you can't document the results, and people from here go back home and what they do next in their ordinary daily routines in teaching and research and so on will, to an extent, be impacted by what we've experienced here. And that's something that you cannot put up in a column and put a line underneath in total. I think one of the most exciting dimensions of this conference, and now I'm comparing to the previous one that I took part in 2 years ago in Pristina, the most exciting part of this conference has been the constant toing and froing and back and forth and tension between theory, educational, pedagogical theory and practice, and the political environment. I mean, if you'd had a conference on citizenship education without this political tension coming in, it would have been a failure. And we've had that. Nothing has been allowed to stand accepted uncritically. We've seen it on several occasions yesterday, we've seen it this morning. I think it's extremely important that that it's possible to do this. I mean, we've discussed citizenship education in terms of, if you like, what I might call a narrow professional definition. But the moment you restrict your concept of citizenship education to that, but think of it in context, and here I think the history of Eastern Europe, but not only Eastern Europe, is very, is a good corrective, because we see how something which on paper sounds good, citizenship education, once you start looking at it in practice, and we've seen examples in presentations through these 3 days, you see how it's very easy to turn this into an instrument for political control. And that's not only within countries. I mean, there's constant reference. I mean, we hear these presentations about citizenship education, its contents and purposes in various countries of southeastern Europe, and you hear the echoes of Brussels. Constant. If you want to become members of the European Union, if you want European financial support for development, post-communism, etc., the support is contingent upon accepting some of these principles that the European Commission imposes across the board. For example, citizenship education is a clear example of something which in principle sounds good, but has a serious element of a West European Commission colonialism. So really one has to say, yes, we accept it, but we accept it critically. Eileen gave a brilliant example of how this works in public schools in the US. It's all for the sake of the corporations. And we've heard examples of the other side of this, citizenship education, and I think this is where the religions can, not necessarily will, but can potentially play a critical, positively critical role, constructive role, namely in the kind of thing we heard this morning from Dr. Shah. Citizenship education as, yes, active participation and all that, knowing how to function in the system, encouraging Nadina's poor students to take a different attitude to life, getting them out into society and playing a constructive role as citizens and workers and economic units, etc., in society, but also empowering people to function in society critically, and that can mean going against the majority, going against the predominant, going against the dominant ideas and the dominant organizations, speaking out, acting out against power. And that kind of citizenship education, I think, can be strengthened on the basis of working with the religion and bringing in the religious critique of the, I don't want to call it secular because I don't want to be demonizing secularism in this. So I find myself falling back on the term that Hanan Alexander criticized yesterday, the non-religious. And going back to Hanan, he wasn't the only one, of course, but I think he articulated it especially strongly yesterday. This whole concept of pedagogy of difference in the corridors around the formal debates, there was a conversation going on, sometimes more loudly than others, between the Iceman and Dimi over the teaching of jihad. The pedagogy of difference. I mean, it's quite clear over decades of Christian-Muslim dialogue that it's very cozy being nice to each other and talking about those things we have in common. But it does not give us a defense against the external pressures that seek to tear us apart. Because in that situation, our differences, which we have not faced up to, are the ones that will be the instruments that tear us apart. So facing up to those differences, and jihad's a good example, but there's other things. And the place in schools, you can't start too early. If you can arm kids with the intellectual ability and the life experience to deal with difference, you make much stronger adults in an open, plural society. And citizenship education, in the way that we've been talking about it here, I think has a major contribution to make. And Following that, Adnan has been running around in the corridors here giving tasks to various people. He's a very dictatorial leader. There's nothing democratic here. He's told me to come up with suggestions for the next one, which is fantastic. This is the 5th one. I've only taken part in the 3rd and the 5th, and I don't remember what the 1st and the 2nd and the 4th were about. So I may come up with a suggestion which you've already dealt with, and he'll turn around and, we've done that. But following out of the nature of some of our discussions today, I really like 3 days like this. Cross-professional, cross-disciplinary, from theory to practice, looking at the interaction between the educational experience and the theological experience. Dr. Shah would call that communicative theology. Get the religious theorists, the theologians. I remember being told by Pakistani and Saudi that Islam doesn't have theology. You can't talk about theology in Islam. Well, I think, look at the discussions we've had over these 3 days. Certainly the European environment requires and necessitates that Muslims think theologically, just as it forces Christians to rethink what they took for granted theologically. And I'd love to see an interaction between people working with educational experience and that impact on theology, and vice versa, the impact of theological new thinking, rethinking, reformulation on educational processes. And although my good friend Bisa Ismaili has gone, I would take up her constant challenge and say, look, what is the role of women in this? In my experience with Muslim students in Britain at university, by far the most exciting, challenging ideas to both Islamic tradition and European tradition has come from young women, is coming from young women. So they possibly complement each other, possibly it's a different conference. The contribution of women, the contribution of women to religious thinking in Europe, Christian, Muslim and other. Get a couple of Jewish women in, the whole place will blow up. So those are my thoughts, Adnan. I hope you can live with them.
Thank you very much. All of the ideas encourage me that we can make better in next conference. But perhaps some ideas from you, Zeki.
Thank you very much. This is my first time participating in this conference. I am very pleased to be here. In fact, I listened to many speakers and I enjoyed many papers. I have to say that I came to a conclusion from this conference that education for our future remains to be of paramount importance. It seems to me that we have two problems with regard to education and contemporary Muslim education in the West, and also general, actually, not only Muslim education, Christian education as well. One is the idea of nationalism, racism, to us much more clearly, the idea of nationalism, because when we teach our children within the concept of nation-state, we teach them that we are the best and other people are sometimes our enemies. In Turkey especially, I was listening to a journalist who was explaining his appointment as a correspondent in Israel. And he said, I went to my grandmother and asked her, I'm going to Israel as a correspondent of Zaman newspaper. And his grandmother said, is that a part of Turkey? Because he said, in my grandmother's mentality, there is only one country in the world other than Turkey, and that's Germany. because only workers are going to Germany, so there is no another country. That mentality, and in education, actually, our environments, our borders are full of enemies. How can we protect ourselves? So all these are based on protection, mentality of protection. And this, the idea of safety is very essential for people. So in order to be safe, we need to have the power of the government. And whatever government imposes on us, we have to accept it, because that is our safety, and the government is protecting us. So that was the tradition, and I think I see this sometimes in the United States. In the United States perhaps the most nation that is concerned about their freedom. That's why we don't have, like many public transportations. Everybody wants to be free, have their own cars. But because of safety, we sacrifice everything almost. At the airports, they check everything of us. But we say, oh, that's okay, because of our safety. So this idea that, brings me to the concept of nationalism as a real problem for our world today. So how can we get rid of this? I have a proposal, and I hope this conference, from my understanding, has contributed to the solution of this problem. And the second problem that we face as Islamic communities, Western communities, and maybe world community, is the idea of extremism, the problem of extremism, misinterpretation or literal interpretation of the text, of religious texts. So how can we get rid of this? I think I propose that after listening to all these wonderful papers, I found really very enrichment in these papers, both theologically and practically, and it was very much diverse from variety of areas, from variety of dimensions. So I propose that based on different papers presented in this conference, we prepared a type of a course, citizenship course. Citizenship course, we have in many countries, it's taught in elementary school and sometimes in middle school. Present such a course that will be helping to develop a world-class citizen, which will include morality, tolerance, values, ethics, regardless of the source of these values. We can say Islam, we can say Christianity, we can say the Quran, the Bible. Not necessarily to mention the Quran or the Bible, but having that concept, I think would be a great, and proposing this through various channels to the, to the United Nations. And United Nations asked the world community to have this standard, valuable course for the peace of the world, I think. And I think that could be applied in many countries, in many educational institutions, and perhaps, because I think from now on, we are no longer isolated. Our world has become a global village. So basically we have one planet, as I mentioned in my article, in my paper. We have one planet and we have one house. And that's why we need a very standard education there. Very standard value that actually shared by all of us. And I think theology can contribute greatly because Muslim theology, I think what Nadima mentioned in her school, she mentioned that she had about 65 students. I said, that's what gives me hope. You have only 65 students. Because I think the lack of education and the lack of Islamic theology is another problem. We don't understand. We just many Muslim students, they don't know anything about Islamic theology. They don't know anything about the Quran. And sometimes they under certain circumstances, like Chechens, generally are educated to fight. Generally, yeah, maybe totally. Well, that causes even interpretation in their own ways. So it's not anymore theological, it's actually based on their circumstances. And they put their circumstances before theology. God said, these were my circumstances, doesn't apply that, so I will go against what the Quran says, basically. So I think that's why Islamic theology can contribute greatly. And within these values, the course style that I mentioned can benefit from Islamic theology and from Christian theology. And I think the points that Daly mentioned, they were very good, very, very good points. That, how we can encourage our upcoming generations to actually consider these things as a part of their curriculum, their value. So I respectfully propose that this idea that I mentioned take place in our outcome declaration, final declaration, outcome document of this conference. And I think this will help to make these efforts more sustainable and institutionalized. Because we need this to be institutionalized and sustainable. And I think if this takes place in a worldwide community and through a variety of educational venues, I think we will be much more successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the real conservation and ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, 5 minutes we have lunch. And after lunch, we want to go where? Can you tell me?
Korean city.
Tell about Korea City.
Wait, do we have lunch here?
Lunch is not here.
No, lunch.
In this building.
Lunch is going to be the same where we had in the last 2 days, I think. And then we are going to go to Korea, which is the city of Skanderbeg, the hero of Albanians here. Although he built like Ottomans, Turks. We are going to visit his castle there, and we are going to get information about the history of Albania. You are also going to get a chance to shop there. They have antique shops, and so you can bring some souvenirs from here to your loved ones.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, for your conservation. It is time for shopping. Now,
One more thing.